Hello and welcome to Capitol Hill and our semi-regular discussion of foreign policy issues. I'm Lyndall Curtis. The Defence Minister, Stephen Smith, gave his latest update to Parliament on Afghanistan today, not long after the news that the United States will begin talks with the Taliban aimed at achieving peace. Although not long after that news, the Taliban claimed responsibility for an attack at the Bagram Air Base which killed 4 US troops. Meanwhile, G8 leaders have been looking at another trouble spot, Syria, supporting a political solution, although differences between the US and Russia remain. Joining me this evening is Green Senator Lee Rhiannon and Liberal MP Josh Frydenberg. Welcome to you both.
Hi, Linda. Hi, Josh.
We'll go first to Afghanistan, where the country's president has announced local military forces have taken full responsibility for the country's security. The Defence Minister outlined what role Australia will play next year, although the size and scope is still to be determined. And Stephen Smith told Parliament the US Taliban talks are welcome.
Australia welcomes the opening of an office in Doha for the purposes of negotiations between the Taliban and the High Peace Council of Afghanistan as part of an Afghan-led peace process. Australia also welcomes the fact that United States representatives will meet the Taliban in Doha for talks aimed at achieving peace in Afghanistan. These talks will necessarily be long, complex and inevitably subject to setbacks, but efforts at peace and reconciliation must continue.
Josh, it's the lesson learnt from previous conflicts that in order to get peace, you have to get the parties who've been warring to the table eventually to negotiate a peace, isn't it?
Sure, and I think in Afghanistan we all want to see a more secure future for the people of Afghanistan, and negotiations with the Taliban are maybe one pathway ahead. Although I think it's going to be very complex and very long, because at the end of the day the Taliban are going to have to recognise the constitution of Afghanistan, which provides for the security and equal treatment of women and minorities. So that's a long way away, I think, and I understand that coalition forces will continue to maintain a parallel military campaign against what is a pretty hardened terrorist-led opposition.
Lee, as both Josh and the Minister have said, the talks will be long and complex, and there would be elements too within the militaries that don't agree with talking to members of the Taliban who've been directly engaged in attacks on troops. So it's a matter of picking who to talk to, isn't it?
Yes, I think you can understand that troops who have been involved in fighting the Taliban, and we've heard about the terrible crimes that had been regularly committed and what their policies are to many people, particularly women. However, they do need to be part of the talks. I think that it actually needed to start earlier than this, and it will be challenging, but we need to see it also in the context that the troops do need to be withdrawn. The Greens' position is that the troops shouldn't have been there, and now there is concerns that the way the Minister spoke today, he is opening up the space for Australian troops to stay there. We know the sections of the US military earlier this year were talking about 14,000 US troops staying in Afghanistan, so that's not going to help the peace process.
Although the Minister did outline a much smaller Australian troop commitment, and Australia has always said there will still be an ongoing role for some troops, including special forces. It is, if you're going to commit troops to a country like Afghanistan, you can't withdraw support completely, can you?
No, and the Greens have always said our position is about the troops being withdrawn when they can be withdrawn safely, but I remain concerned about formulations that the Minister used, that there could be more Australian troops staying there, and that's not the best for the Afghani people. It's a tragic mess. I believe that the Australian and the foreign presence, the NATO presence, has made it worse. And by continuing to keep troops there is not going to help the talks or the solution for the Afghani people.
See, I disagree totally with that, Lyndall, because I go back to the reason why we went to Afghanistan in the first place and why Australia was part of a 40-plus nation coalition that has tried to bring peace to that country. And it's because Afghanistan was the global headquarters for terrorism. We'd seen 9/11. we'd seen the deaths in Bali, we'd seen attacks in London and Madrid and so forth. In every single case, the perpetrators of those attacks had some links back to Afghanistan and the training there. So that's why we went there. Now, at that time, since that time, we've actually built up an Afghan National Army, we've built up an Afghan National Police to the point that they're ready to take control. But if you leave altogether, then they won't have the instructors and the other assistance that is necessary to keep an ongoing vigilance in that country.
Would you like to see, Lee, the Australian government be able to spell out more clearly, apart from Special Forces, what the troops will be doing, whether they'll be continuing to assist with training, whether they will be helping secure certainly the growth in aid and development that Australia will be sending?
Look, there certainly needs to be more openness from the Australian government about what their plans are with regard to military links with Afghanistan, because that was one of the concerns that the Greens brought when the new Parliament formed, that there hadn't been an openness. We didn't have the debate within Parliament even about the troops going in the first place. But I think that Josh is putting too rosy a picture on how our troops are operating in that country and the support and the training of the Afghanis. Like, we have these terrible green on blue killings, and more the evidence is coming out that very few of those are because of the Taliban infiltration, that a lot of it's because of cultural insensitivity, the way those troops are being managed. And again, how many armies have invaded Afghanistan? How many armies have failed? By far the majority of them. I don't think anybody, and Josh is a good one with history, but can you name any foreign power that's gone into Afghanistan that has succeeded?
Well,
like, that's not what's good for the Afghani people.
There are, though, Josh, some positive signs, some step forwards as well, and part of that was the Afghan President Hamid Karzai saying Afghanistan is taking over control of its own security. It will, though, be a very long time before people can say this is settled, the work is done.
Absolutely right, and I do think we've made a real difference on the ground in terms of the facilities and the rights of women, in terms of the humanitarian assistance we've been able to give. I went to Afghanistan and visited the Australian troops a couple of years ago, and I saw firsthand what they were doing on the ground, including helping to protect a newly built school for girls. And I think, we've done a lot of good things together with our coalition, other coalition forces in this regard. So I'm very proud of what our troops have done in Afghanistan for the better.
We might move on now to Syria, where the G8 leaders have backed a plan for a political solution, but left out mention of the Syrian president's fate. The US has decided to send weapons, small arms, to the rebels in the wake of evidence, it says, that chemical weapons have been used in the Syrian conflict. Lee, this is a particularly difficult issue, isn't it? Because you have major powers like Russia and the US disagreeing on the way forward for Syria.
Oh yes, look, at the international level I think it's quite disgraceful that we aren't getting that cooperation from Russia and China, but at the same time the Greens remain deeply concerned about any talk about arms going into the rebels, and I think our Foreign Minister, Senator Bob Carr, is to be congratulated that he has ruled out having any involvement with small arms or in any way, and that's very important. I thought it was actually interesting that the Minister took that step. And again, we understand that Josh is very keen on foreign affairs and may like to be the minister one day. Would you break with the US alliance in that way? Because I think Mr. Carr, Senator Carr, has done the right thing here for the Syrians in a very complex situation.
It does show, Josh, it is more difficult to deal with a conflict in a country which has more importance both regionally and attachments to major powers like Russia.
Absolutely. I mean, I think what's happened in Syria is a real tragedy, Lyndall. I mean, not just 93,000 people plus have been killed, but we're talking about over 1.5 million refugees. We're talking about neighbouring countries like Turkey and Egypt and Jordan and Saudi Arabia all being drawn in. And the fact reports that Iran has sent 4,000 Revolutionary Guard to fight there, not least of which are their proxy in Lebanon, Hezbollah. So this has even greater potential to create destabilisation in the region. It's a real stalemate with Russia and China vetoing further action at the United Nations. The Americans are obviously seeing a red line that's been crossed with reports that poisonous gases and chemical weapons have been used against the Syrian people. So I think this is a real tragedy, but the world needs to act, because you just can't see a situation like this going on indefinitely.
What action can be taken, though?
Well,
does it live in the realm of trying to find a political solution?
Well, we've talked obviously about a peace conference in Geneva later this year, but I noticed that the G8 communique made no reference to Assad himself, so that's obviously a reflection of the divisions between the parties. The Americans have made sounds that they will support maybe weaponry to go to the rebels. That has to be very careful there, because you don't want to give the weaponry to more radical elements, and we understand Al-Qaeda is present in that country, so that's a very difficult balancing act. But I think something needs to be done. Otherwise, the might of Iran, together with Hezbollah, together with sophisticated Russian artillery and missiles and the like, making its way to Syria, will see Assad prevail if the rest of the world doesn't act.
And Lee, do you have views on what needs to be done, what is possible?
Look, I think a date needs to be set for the talks. That's very vital. Also, there is a European Union arms embargo, but lately it's been weakened. That needs to be strengthened, because the tragedy of so many of these conflicts is that it becomes a huge profit-making exercise for the military companies. And at the moment, so many arms are just flowing in there. The European Union did the right thing, but now they're weakening that embargo, and that's a real setback. But the priority should be setting a date for those talks.
As you mentioned, Josh, there are huge numbers of refugees moving out from Syria. There seems to be little that Australia could do, certainly on the military front. Should Australia be looking at helping those countries deal with that flow of refugees? Certainly,
in terms of humanitarian assistance, that's got to be a priority. I mean, we've got an important part to play in that way. But we also need to be talking to the Americans to understanding what they're thinking going on here. David Cameron in the United Kingdom has been pretty outspoken as well as the host of the G8 conference. He was looking to strike a better deal on Syria. So we've got plenty of partners that are deeply engaged in this issue, and we need to be talking regularly to them.
And we do also have a seat on the UN Security Council. Does that provide the opportunities to have those talks?
Oh, look, I think enormously so. But at the end of the day, Australia is a minor player here, and that's where our role with refugees can be critical. I was in Lebanon in January this year, and I was actually at a Palestinian camp when a woman arrived. I was at the Union Aid Abroad Childcare Centre. A Palestinian refugee who had been living all her life in Syria arrived with her family of 13 looking for a little room. And then I've just heard of so many cases. Lebanon's looking of 1 million refugees from Syria by the end of the year. And I think those countries, Turkey, Lebanon, all those countries who are taking these millions now of refugees, do need more support, and Australia can play a role there.
That's where we'll have to leave it. We haven't quite solved all the problems of the world, but maybe taken a little step forward. Josh Frydenberg and Lee Rhiannon, thank you very much for your time.
Lyndall.
Thank you, Lyndall. Thanks, good Josh.
And thank you for joining Capitol Hill. We will be back at the same time tomorrow. Until then, good night.